Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is believe they deserve more than the hand life dealt them. Sometimes it takes meeting someone who sees your worth when you've forgotten it yourself. In 1883, Red Rock, a woman named Mary Bell, who's worked as a house servant her whole life, does something that shocks everyone. She looks her employer, cattle baron Barrett Kane, straight in the eye and asks him to teach her how to be his wife. Barrett is a widowed rancher, haunted by war and loss. His heart has grown as cold as winter wind. When Maribel speaks those brave words, everything changes. This isn't your typical love story. It's about two broken people finding the courage to heal. But what dark secret from Barrett's past makes him believe he doesn't deserve the love this remarkable woman offers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested over the Red Rock Mountains, casting long shadows across the sprawling Kane Ranch that stretched further than most folks could ride in a day. Barrett Kane stood on the wide porch of his 2-story ranch house, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching his cattle spread across the valley like scattered coins on green felt. At 42, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. His shoulders were broad from years of ranch work, his hands scarred from barbed wire and branding irons, but it was his eyes that told the real story, grey as storm clouds and just as distant. The silver pocket watch in his vest had stopped ticking 3 years ago, the hands frozen at 2:47. Sarah's time. The moment his wife had drawn her last breath in their bedroom upstairs, this same watch clutched in her pale fingers as she whispered his name one final time. He'd never had it repaired. Some things were meant to stay broken. "Morning, Mr. Kane." The voice came soft as morning mist, and Barrett turned to see Maribel emerging from the kitchen door, a worn leather Bible tucked under her arm like a shield against the world's cruelties. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who'd learned long ago that drawing attention could bring trouble. Her dress was simple brown cotton, mended in places but clean, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun that couldn't quite hide its lustrous waves. "Morning, Maribel." His voice carried the gravel of a man who didn't waste words. She'd been working his ranch for 3 years now, ever since old Jim Hartwell had traded her contract to settle a gambling debt. Barrett still remembered that day, the way she'd stood in his doorway with her small canvas bag and that same Bible, chin raised despite the fear in her dark eyes. She'd been 19 then, too young for the weight she carried in her shoulders. "Coffee's fresh if you want more," she said, already moving toward the laundry, lines where yesterday's washing hung like ghosts in the morning breeze. "Breakfast will be ready when you are." Barrett watched her work, the efficient way she moved through her tasks without complaint or conversation. In 3 years, he'd never heard her raise her voice, never seen her shirk a duty, never caught her looking at him with anything more than polite respect. She was invisible in the way that good servants learned to be, present when needed, gone when not, as reliable as sunrise, and just as taken for granted. The ranch hands were already stirring in the bunkhouse. Barrett could see smoke rising from their chimney and hear the low murmur of voices as men prepared for another day of mending fences and moving cattle. His foreman, Diego Santos, emerged first, a compact man with silver threading his mustache and the kind of steady reliability Barrett had come to depend on. "Morning, Patron," Diego called, settling his hat against the morning sun. "The boys are talking about moving the north herd down to the creek pasture today. Grass is better there." "Good idea," Barrett replied. though his attention drifted back to Maribel as she hung his shirts with careful precision. Something about the way the morning light caught in her hair reminded him of Sarah, though the two women were nothing alike. Sarah had been blonde and delicate, like spun gold and morning flowers. Maribel was earth and shadow, strength wrapped in quiet dignity. The other hands emerged gradually. Buck Wilson with his perpetual grin and easy laugh. Tom Henley, who rarely spoke, but could gentle the wildest horse, and young Jake Martinez, who still had the eager enthusiasm of youth, unmarked by too many disappointments. They greeted Barrett with respectful nods before heading toward the corral where their horses waited. "Maribel," Barrett found himself saying as she reached for the empty laundry basket. She turned, and for a moment their eyes met directly. Not the quick glance of servant to master, but something deeper. Something that made him forget what he'd intended to say. "Yes, sir." The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying campfire. Barrett felt a strange stirring in his chest, an awareness he'd thought buried with Sarah. Maribel's eyes were the color of rich chocolate, flecked with gold that caught the light. They held intelligence and strength, qualities he'd never really noticed before. "Nothing," he said finally, turning back toward the horizon. "Just thank you for the coffee." "You're welcome, sir." When he looked again, she was gone, disappeared into the house like morning mist. But something had shifted in that moment of eye contact, some recognition that made the familiar ranch feel suddenly unfamiliar. Barrett had built this place with his own hands, starting with nothing but a government land grant and the determination of a young man who'd survived a war that had tried its best to kill him. The original cabin still stood behind the main house, now used for storage, its rough-hewn logs a reminder of harder times, when every board and nail had been precious as gold. Sarah had arrived 5 years after the war ended, the daughter of a banker from Denver who'd seen opportunity in the growing cattle business. She'd been refined and educated, with soft hands that had never known hard work and a laugh like silver bells. Barrett had fallen for her the moment she'd stepped off the stage in Red Rock, her yellow dress bright as sunshine against the dusty street. Their marriage had been good, if not passionate, built on mutual respect and shared dreams of the future they would build together. Sarah had brought grace to his rough existence, teaching him to appreciate music and literature, softening his war-hardened edges with patient kindness. When she'd died of the fever 3 years ago, Barrett had thought his capacity for feeling died with her. The pocket watch ticked in his memory, its steady rhythm a heartbeat he'd tried to forget. Sarah's final words echoed across the years. "Don't let yourself become a ghost, Barrett. Promise me." He'd promised, but promises to the dead were harder to keep than those to the living. Now, as he watched the morning come alive around him, Barrett found himself thinking about Maribel in ways that felt like betrayal. How had he never noticed the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength in her movements, the way she hummed softly to herself when she thought no one could hear, old hymns that spoke of faith maintained despite hardship? Diego approached again, hat in hand. "Patron, there's something else. Buck saw riders yesterday, up on the ridge. Could be nothing but—" "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Watching the herd." Barrett nodded grimly. Cattle rustling was a constant threat in this part of Colorado, where the law was thin as winter grass and might often made right. He'd dealt with rustlers before, usually with words backed by the Winchester rifle that hung over his mantle. But lately, the gangs were getting bolder, more organized. "Double the night watch," he said, "and keep the rifles cleaned." "Si, Patron." As Diego walked away, Barrett found his gaze drawn once more toward the kitchen window, where Maribel moved like a shadow behind the glass. She'd been part of his world for 3 years, yet he realized he knew almost nothing about her beyond her daily duties. Where had she come from before Hartwell's gambling brought her here? What dreams had she buried beneath that quiet efficiency? The questions troubled him more than they should have. Maribel was his employee, nothing more. The gulf between their stations was as wide as the valley that held his cattle, as deep as the war graves that held his friends. She deserved better than a broken-down widower who kept time with a dead woman's watch. But when she emerged again to ring the breakfast bell, their eyes met once more across the yard. This time, neither looked away first. This time, Barrett saw something in her gaze that made his dead heart skip a beat, a recognition, a question, a possibility that scared him more than any rustler ever could. The sound of the bell echoed across the morning, calling them all to another day's beginning. But Barrett stood frozen on his porch, watching Maribel disappear into the house, knowing with sudden certainty that something fundamental had just changed in his carefully ordered world. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning shadows, but the shadow Maribel had cast across his heart remained. For the first time in 3 years, Barrett Kane felt the dangerous stirring of hope, and it terrified him more than any bullet ever had. 3 days later, the moment came that would change everything. Barrett was in his study, ledgers spread across the mahogany desk Sarah had insisted on ordering from Denver. The numbers swam before his tired eyes. Feed costs, cattle prices, wages for the hands. The ranch was profitable, had been for years, but profit felt hollow when there was no one to share it with, no legacy to build beyond his own mortality. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in." Maribel entered, carrying a tray with coffee and the biscuits she'd baked that morning. But something was different about her today. She moved with purpose rather than her usual quiet efficiency, and when she set the tray down, she didn't immediately turn to leave. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Kane?" The words were the same ones she spoke every evening, but her tone carried weight, as if each syllable had been carefully measured. "No, thank you, Maribel." Barrett reached for the coffee, expecting to hear the door close behind her. Instead, he heard her draw a breath, long, steady, like someone preparing to jump from a great height. "Actually, sir, there is something I need to say." Barrett's hand stilled on the cup handle. In 3 years, Maribel had never initiated a conversation beyond the necessary exchanges of daily life. He looked up to find her standing straighter than usual, her hands clasped before her, fingers worrying at something hidden in her palm. "What is it?" She met his eyes directly, and Barrett saw steel beneath the soft brown depths. "I've been thinking about my situation here, Mr. Kane, about my future." A chill ran down Barrett's spine. "You want to leave?" It wasn't a question. "No, sir." Her voice was steady as bedrock. "I want to stay. But not as I am now." Barrett set down his coffee, giving her his full attention. Something in her manner demanded it, a gravity that reminded him of soldiers before battle, when courage was the only thing standing between a man and his deepest fears. "I don't understand." Maribel opened her palm, revealing a simple brass ring, worn thin with age. Her mother's ring, the only thing she'd brought with her, besides the clothes on her back and her grandmother's Bible. Barrett had glimpsed it only once before, when she'd been washing dishes and it had caught the light. 3 years ago, I came here with nothing but a debt to pay and no choice in the matter, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I've worked hard, kept your house, cooked your meals, and asked for nothing beyond shelter and food. I've been grateful for the kindness you've shown me, for treating me with respect when others might not have." She paused, and Barrett found himself holding his breath. "But I'm 22 years old, Mr. Kane, and I've been thinking about what comes next, about what I want from this life, before it's too late to want anything at all. Maribel, please let me finish." The firmness in her voice surprised them both. "I've watched you these 3 years. I've seen your kindness to your men, your fairness in your dealings, the way you honor your late wife's memory. You're a good man, even if you don't believe it yourself." Barrett's chest tightened. Where was this leading? "I know I'm speaking out of turn," Maribel continued, her fingers tightening around the brass ring. "I know the difference in our stations, the impropriety of what I'm about to say. But I also know that chances like this don't come twice in a lifetime, and I'd rather face your anger than spend the rest of my days wondering, what if?" She took another breath, and Barrett saw her summon every ounce of courage she possessed. "Tell me how to be your wife." The words hung in the air between them, like a challenge to the natural order of things. Barrett felt the earth shift beneath him, his carefully ordered world tilting on its axis. For a moment, he could only stare at her, this woman who cleaned his house and mended his clothes, who had just spoken the most audacious words he'd ever heard. "Maribel." His voice came out rougher than intended. "I know what you're thinking," she said quickly, color rising in her cheeks but her gaze never wavering. "That I'm overstepping, that I don't know my place. But my place is what I make it, Mr. Kane. I've spent 3 years learning your ways, understanding what you need, caring for your home. I've seen you when you think no one's watching. The loneliness in your eyes, the way you touch that stopped watch when you think you're alone." Barrett's hand instinctively moved to his vest pocket, and Maribel's eyes followed the gesture. "I'm not asking you to love me," she continued, though the words clearly cost her something. "I'm not asking you to forget your Sarah or pretend I could replace her. I'm asking you to teach me how to be the wife you need now, the partner who could help you build something new instead of just tending the grave of something old." The silence stretched between them, thick with possibility and danger. Barrett's mind reeled with a dozen responses: shock, anger, confusion, something that might have been hope if he'd been brave enough to name it. "You don't know what you're saying," he said finally. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm saying that we could have something good here, something real. I'm saying that I see you, Barrett Kane, not just the rancher or the widower, but the man underneath who's been hiding from life for 3 years. And I'm saying that I think we could make each other less alone." Barrett stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to show. His reflection stared back, a man caught between the past and a future he'd never dared imagine. "You're a servant," he said to the glass, hating himself for the words even as he spoke them. "I was a servant," Maribel corrected gently. "Just like you were a soldier. We don't have to stay what we were." He turned to face her, and what he saw in her expression nearly undid him. Not the desperate hope of someone grasping at salvation, but the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her own worth and was simply stating facts. "The whole territory would talk," he said weakly. "Let them talk." Her chin lifted with a pride that transformed her face. "I'd rather be talked about as your wife than ignored as your servant." Barrett felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart after Sarah's death. Maribel stood there like an angel of possibility, offering him a future he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "There are things about me, things you don't know. Then tell me." She stepped closer, and he caught the scent of lavender soap and honest work. "Tell me what haunts you, what makes you believe you're not worthy of happiness. Tell me, and let me decide for myself whether it matters." The offer hung between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Barrett looked into her eyes and saw not judgment, but patience. Not pity, but strength. For one wild moment, he almost believed it could work. Almost believed he could be the man she seemed to think he was. Then reality crashed back like a cold wave. "No." The word came out harder than he intended. It's impossible, Maribel. I'm sorry, but the answer is no." The light in her eyes dimmed, but she didn't flinch. "I see. I hope you'll continue with your duties," Barrett said stiffly, hating himself for retreating behind the master-servant barrier. "This conversation doesn't have to change anything." Maribel slipped the brass ring back into her pocket with dignity intact. "Of course not, Mr. Kane. Will there be anything else this evening?" "No, thank you." She turned toward the door, but paused with her hand on the knob. "For what it's worth," she said without looking back. "I meant every word, and I don't regret asking." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Barrett alone with his ledgers and his cowardice. Outside, the first snowflakes of an early October storm began to fall, and Barrett Kane stood at his window, watching them blur the world into something unrecognizable, wondering if he'd just thrown away his last chance at happiness. The next morning brought an uncomfortable tension that settled over the ranch house like morning fog. Barrett found his coffee waiting on the kitchen table as always, but Maribel was nowhere to be seen. Her absence felt louder than her presence ever had. He discovered her in the chicken coop, gathering eggs with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every task. But something had changed in her bearing. Not defeat, exactly, but a kind of resigned dignity that cut deeper than tears would have. "Morning," he said awkwardly. "Good morning, Mr. Kane." Her tone was perfectly polite, perfectly distant. The warmth that had been growing between them over the past few days had vanished like smoke. Barrett wanted to say something, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he retreated to the safety of ranch business, throwing himself into work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. But escape proved impossible. At every turn, he found himself hyper-aware of Maribel's presence, the way she moved through her duties with mechanical precision, the absence of the soft humming that usually accompanied her work, the careful way she avoided his eyes. It was Diego who finally forced the issue, cornering Barrett near the barn after lunch. "Patron, what happened?" The older man's weathered face was creased with concern. "The señorita, she seems different today." "Nothing happened," Barrett said too quickly. "Just ranch business." Diego's skeptical look suggested he wasn't buying it. "In 30 years of knowing you, I have learned to read the signs. You are troubled, and she is hurt. This is not nothing." Before Barrett could respond, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. A rider was coming up the valley road, someone Barrett recognized with a sinking heart. Frank Morrison, owner of the neighboring Lazy M Ranch, riding his flashy chestnut gelding like he was leading a parade. Morrison was everything Barrett wasn't. Smooth-talking, well-dressed, with the kind of easy charm that came from never having faced real hardship. He was also unmarried, wealthy, and had been making increasingly obvious visits to Red Rock lately, always finding excuses to stop by the Kane Ranch. "Barrett!" Morrison called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the false heartiness of a politician. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Frank." Barrett's greeting was notably cooler. "What brings you by?" "Oh, just neighborly concern." Morrison's eyes were already scanning the ranch yard, and Barrett knew exactly what, or whom, he was looking for. "Heard there might be rustler trouble in the area. Thought I'd offer my assistance. Appreciate the concern, but we can handle our own problems." Morrison's smile didn't waver. Of course. You always were the independent type." His gaze sharpened as Maribel emerged from the house, carrying a basket of laundry to the line. "Ah, there's the lovely Miss Maribel. How are you this fine day?" Barrett felt his jaw clench. Morrison had started paying attention to Maribel about 6 months ago, during one of his neighborly visits. The man's interest was obvious to everyone, except apparently Maribel herself. "I'm well, thank you, Mr. Morrison," Maribel replied politely, not pausing in her work. "Please call me Frank." Morrison approached the laundry line with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I was just telling Barrett here about the social at the church next weekend. I don't suppose you'd consider allowing me the honor of escorting you." Barrett's hands clenched into fists. The surge of jealousy that roared through him was as unexpected as it was overwhelming. He had no right to feel possessive of Maribel. He'd made that clear enough last night. But watching Morrison's practiced smile and calculating eyes fixed on her made Barrett want to reach for the rifle hanging over his mantel. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison," Maribel said carefully, "but I don't think it would be appropriate." "Nonsense!" Morrison's laugh was too loud, too forced. "You work hard, deserve a little enjoyment. Barrett here wouldn't mind sparing you for one evening, would you, Barrett?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Barrett found himself trapped between his rejection of Maribel's proposal and his unwillingness to see her in another man's arms. Maribel had gone very still, her hands frozen on the sheet she'd been hanging, waiting for his response. "That's up to Miss Maribel," Barrett said finally, the words tasting like sawdust in his mouth. Something flickered across Maribel's face. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Morrison. But I must decline." Morrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps another time, then." After Morrison left, the silence between Barrett and Maribel grew even more pronounced. He found himself watching her from the corner of his eye, noting the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she attacked her chores with unusual vigor. That evening, as she served dinner, their fingers accidentally brushed when she handed him his plate. The contact was brief, innocent, but it sent a shock through Barrett's system that made him jerk his hand back as if burned. "Sorry," he muttered. "My fault," she replied quietly. But later that night, Barrett found himself pacing his study like a caged wolf. Morrison's visit had crystallized something he'd been trying to ignore. Maribel wouldn't stay unnoticed forever. She was young, beautiful, intelligent. Eventually, some man would see what Barrett was too cowardly to claim. The thought tormented him. In his desk drawer, hidden beneath correspondence and legal papers, lay the war medal he'd never displayed, a piece of bronze and ribbon that represented everything he'd lost and everything he believed himself unworthy of. His court-martial papers lay beside it, the official documentation of his disgrace. He pulled out the medal now, weighing its familiar heft in his palm. The inscription read, "For valor above and beyond the call of duty." But all Barrett could remember was the court-martial that had followed, the accusations of insubordination, the way his fellow officers had turned their backs when he'd chosen civilian lives over military orders. Sarah had never known the full truth. She'd died believing he was a hero, and Barrett had let her believe it rather than burden her with the reality of his shame. But Maribel had looked at him last night as if she could see straight through to his soul, as if she would accept whatever darkness she found there. A soft sound from the kitchen interrupted his brooding. Through the thin walls, he could hear Maribel moving quietly about her evening routines. He imagined her banking the fire, checking the locks, preparing for another day of service in a house where she'd offered her heart and been turned away. Barrett closed his eyes, remembering the courage in her voice when she'd asked him to teach her how to be his wife. She'd stood there with nothing but her dignity and her determination, offering him a future he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve, and he'd thrown it back at her like it meant nothing, but it meant everything. That was the problem. In the morning, he told himself, he would find a way to bridge the gap between them. Not as master and servant, not even as potential husband and wife, but as two people who had somehow become essential to each other's daily existence. In the morning, he would try to find the courage Maribel had shown so effortlessly. In the morning, he would stop being a coward. But morning felt very far away as Barrett sat in his study, holding a medal that reminded him of every reason why a good woman like Maribel deserved better than a broken-down soldier who couldn't even fix his own pocket watch. Barrett's resolve to bridge the gap proved easier planned than executed. 3 more days passed in careful politeness, each interaction between them measured and distant. Then a broken fence on the south pasture provided an unexpected opportunity. "I'll need to ride out and assess the damage," Barrett told Diego over breakfast. "Looks like the cattle scattered pretty far." "I can handle it, patron," Diego offered. But Barrett shook his head. "No, you take the boys and work on the creek crossing. I'll manage the fence." What he didn't expect was to find Maribel saddling the old paint mare in the barn. "Where are you going?" The question came out sharper than he intended. "To check on Mrs. Patterson." Maribel didn't look up from adjusting the stirrups. "She's been poorly since her husband passed, and I promised to bring her some of yesterday's bread." Barrett knew the Patterson homestead, a small cabin about 2 miles south, right in the direction of his broken fence. The coincidence felt like fate offering him a second chance. "I'll ride with you," he said, before he could lose his nerve. Got fence work in that direction anyway. Maribel paused in her preparations, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. "That's not necessary, Mr. Kane. Maybe not necessary, but practical. These trails can be dangerous for a woman alone." For a moment, he thought she might refuse. Then she nodded curtly and finished saddling her horse. They rode in silence for the first mile, the morning air crisp with the promise of autumn. Barrett found himself stealing glances at Maribel, noting the easy way she sat her horse, the quiet confidence in her handling of the reins. Sarah had never been comfortable on horseback, another reminder of how different these two women were. "How long have you been riding?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Since I was small." Her voice carried the careful neutrality she'd maintained since their conversation. "My father believed girls should know how to handle horses as well as boys." It was more personal information than she'd shared in 3 years, and Barrett found himself hungry for more. "Your father, what did he do?" Maribel was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "Then, he was a preacher. Had a small church outside Austin, Texas. Mother taught school when there was one to teach in." Past tense. Barrett noted the carefully controlled emotion in her voice. "They're gone? Fever took them both when I was 16. The words were matter of fact, but Barrett heard the old pain beneath them. "I tried to keep the church going, but a 16-year-old girl preaching didn't sit well with the congregation. Lost the building to debts within a year." The story explained so much: her quiet strength, her faith despite hardship, the way she carried herself with dignity even when circumstances tried to strip it from her. Barrett felt a surge of admiration mixed with guilt. Here he was, wallowing in self-pity over his own losses, while she'd rebuilt her life from nothing. How did you end up with Hartwell? The question was impertinent, but he found he needed to know. Desperation makes people do things they never thought they would. Maribel's voice remained steady. Jim Hartwell offered me work and shelter when I had neither. The terms seemed fair at the time. Barrett had known Hartwell, a crude man with wandering hands and a taste for gambling. The idea of Maribel at his mercy made Barrett's blood run cold. He never... Barrett couldn't finish the question, but Maribel understood. No. Her voice carried quiet steel. I made it clear from the beginning that I'd rather starve than compromise myself. Jim Hartwell was many things, but he wasn't that kind of monster. They'd reached a fork in the trail, and Barrett found himself reluctant to part ways. "Maribel," he said, drawing rein, "about the other night." "There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Kane." She kept her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I spoke out of turn, and you responded appropriately. The matter is closed." "Is it?" The words came out more forcefully than he intended. "Because I can't seem to close it." That got her attention. She turned to face him fully, and Barrett saw something flicker in her dark eyes. Hope, perhaps, or wariness. "What do you mean?" Barrett struggled with the words, feeling like a schoolboy attempting his first declaration. "I mean that I can't stop thinking about what you said, about teaching you to be my wife. And I..." He stopped, frustrated by his own cowardice. Here was this remarkable woman who'd already shown more courage in one conversation than he'd managed in 3 years, and he couldn't even form a complete sentence. A distant sound interrupted them, the lowing of cattle where none should be. Barrett's head snapped toward the sound, his rancher's instincts overriding his personal turmoil. "That's my herd," he said grimly. "They've scattered further than I thought." Without another word, they spurred their horses toward the sound. What they found made Barrett's blood boil. His cattle were being driven eastward by 3 riders, clearly rustlers making off with his stock in broad daylight. "Stay here," Barrett ordered, reaching for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "I don't think so." Maribel's voice was calm but determined. 3 against 1 isn't good odds, even for you." Before Barrett could protest, she'd urged her mare forward, circling wide to get ahead of the rustlers. Barrett cursed under his breath and followed, his heart pounding with more than just adrenaline. The rustlers hadn't expected resistance. When Barrett's warning shot cracked across the morning air, 2 of them immediately abandoned the stolen cattle and rode hard for the hills. The third, bolder or more desperate, wheeled his horse and charged directly at Barrett. What happened next would replay in Barrett's mind for years afterward. As the rustler bore down on him, Barrett's horse shied at the gunshot, throwing off his aim. The rustler's pistol was coming up when Maribel's mare thundered past, the woman herself swinging a heavy tree branch she'd somehow acquired. The branch connected with the rustler's gun arm with a solid crack, sending his weapon spinning into the grass. The fight went out of the man immediately. Clutching his injured arm, he wheeled his horse and fled after his companions, leaving Barrett's cattle milling confusedly in the meadow. Barrett stared at Maribel, who sat her horse as calmly as if she'd been discussing the weather. "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" "Language, Mr. Kane," she said mildly, though he caught the glint of humor in her eyes. "And you'd be surprised what a preacher's daughter picks up when she's trying to survive on her own." For the first time in days, Barrett found himself genuinely smiling. Remind me never to underestimate you again. I'll hold you to that." The warmth in her voice was the first crack in the wall of politeness she'd maintained since their confrontation. As they worked together to gather the scattered cattle, Barrett found himself seeing Maribel with new eyes. This wasn't just a servant who'd spoken out of turn. This was a partner, someone who could stand beside him in crisis and meet whatever came their way. When they finally parted at the trail fork, Barrett touched his hat brim in a gesture of respect. "Thank you, Maribel, for everything." "You're welcome," she replied quietly. Then, as she rode away toward the Patterson cabin, she called back, "And Barrett, that offer still stands, whenever you're ready to stop being afraid." Barrett watched her disappear around the bend, his heart hammering against his ribs. For the first time since Sarah's death, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he might be ready to start living again. The change between them was subtle, but unmistakable. Over the following week, their conversations grew longer, their silences more comfortable. Barrett found himself lingering over coffee in the morning, listening to Maribel's observations about the weather, the livestock, the small rhythms of ranch life that he'd never thought to discuss with anyone. It was during one of these morning talks that she surprised him again. "Your fence posts on the north pasture are rotting," she said matter-of-factly, refilling his cup. "I noticed when I was gathering herbs yesterday. The cattle will be through them before winter, if you don't replace them soon." Barrett looked up from his newspaper, struck by her casual competence. "You know about fence posts?" "I know about a lot of things." There was no boasting in her voice, just simple fact. When you're trying to keep a homestead running with no money and no help, you learn what needs doing and how to do it. That afternoon, Barrett found himself asking her to accompany him on his inspection of the north fence. Her assessment proved accurate. The posts were indeed compromised, some of them rotting at the base where moisture had collected over years of freeze and thaw cycles. "How did you know?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Same way you know when a horse is favoring a leg or when a cow's about to calve," she replied, running her fingers along a weakened post. "You pay attention long enough, patterns become clear." As they worked side by side, replacing the worst of the damaged posts, Barrett found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years, about the early days of building the ranch, about the bitter winter when half his cattle had died, about the flood that had taken out the original barn. "Sarah hated that flood," he said, surprising himself with the admission. She'd worked so hard planning the garden around the old barn. When the water came through, it washed away months of her work. Maribel was quiet for a moment, holding a new post steady while Barrett hammered. "What did she do?" "Cried for about an hour, then rolled up her sleeves and started over." The memory brought a smile to Barrett's face. "She was like that. Never stayed down long. She sounds like she was a good woman." "She was." Barrett paused in his hammering, meeting Maribel's eyes. "But she wasn't strong like you. Not in the same way." The admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Maribel's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. "Strength comes in different forms," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's enduring hardship. Sometimes it's choosing hope when despair would be easier." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Barrett found himself speaking about things he'd never shared with anyone. "The war changed me," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "Not just because of what I saw, but because of what I did. Choices I made." Maribel was quiet beside him, her presence a steady comfort in the gathering twilight. "I was a captain in the 5th Colorado," Barrett continued, We were ordered to move through a valley where Confederate sympathizers were supposed to be hiding supplies. Our orders were clear: burn everything, question anyone we found. He stopped, the memories as sharp as broken glass even after all these years. There was a farmhouse, he said finally. Family inside. Old man, his daughter, 2 small children. My commanding officer said they were harboring enemy supplies, ordered us to burn them out. But I'd searched that house myself. They had nothing but a few sacks of grain and some winter clothes. Maribel's hand moved across the space between them, her fingers brushing his. The touch was light as a butterfly wing, but it anchored him to the present. I disobeyed the order, Barrett said. Told my men to stand down, let the family escape before we fired the house. Saved their lives, but cost me my career. Court-martial came swift as summer lightning. What happened? Officially? Insubordination and failure to follow direct orders. Unofficially, I'd embarrassed my commanding officer in front of the men. Made him look like the kind of man who'd burn children alive for the sake of following orders. Barrett's voice grew bitter. They stripped me of my rank, my pension, everything but my discharge papers. Said I was lucky they didn't shoot me for treason. But you saved those people? 4 lives against my entire future. Barrett laughed, but there was no humor in it. Some days I wonder if it was worth it. Maribel's grip on his hand tightened. Don't you ever wonder that? Not ever. That fierce conviction in her voice made Barrett look at her. In the dying light, her eyes blazed with something that took his breath away. You think I did the right thing? I think you did the only thing a decent man could do. Her voice was steady as stone. I think those children grew up because you had the courage to choose what was right over what was easy. I think you're exactly the kind of man who deserves happiness, not the broken shell you've convinced yourself you are. Barrett felt something shift inside his chest, some long-frozen part of him beginning to thaw. Maribel! The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Diego appeared around the corner of the house, his face grim in the lamplight. "Patron, we have trouble," the foreman said without preamble. "Morrison was here while you were out. Left a message." Barrett's jaw clenched. "What kind of message?" "The kind that comes with conditions." Diego handed over a folded paper. "He wants to meet with you tomorrow. Says it's about Miss Maribel." Barrett unfolded the note, reading Morrison's flowery script by lamplight. The message was brief but clear. Morrison was formally requesting permission to court Maribel, and he expected an answer within the week. "That presumptuous!" Barrett caught himself before the curse escaped, but his hands were already clenching into fists. "What does it say?" Maribel asked quietly. Barrett handed her the note, watching her face as she read. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Well," she said finally, folding the paper with deliberate precision. "That's certainly direct." "You're not seriously considering it," Barrett said, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. Maribel looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "That depends, Mr. Kane. Are you going to give me a reason not to?" The question hung between them like a challenge, like an opportunity, like the last chance he might ever have to choose courage over fear. Barrett thought about the faded daguerreotype hidden in his desk drawer, himself and his fellow soldiers, young and proud and convinced they were fighting for something noble. He thought about the court-martial, about Sarah's death, about all the ways he'd convinced himself he wasn't worthy of love. Then he looked at Maribel, sitting beside him in the lamplight, offering him a future he'd never dared dream of. For the first time in 3 years, Barrett Kane began to believe he might be brave enough to reach for it. Barrett didn't sleep that night. He paced his study until the floorboards creaked in protest, Morrison's note lying on his desk like an accusation. By dawn, he'd made his decision, or rather, his heart had made it for him. He found Maribel in the kitchen, humming softly as she kneaded bread dough. The sound stopped when she saw his expression. "You look like a man who's wrestled with angels all night," she observed quietly. Something like that. Barrett pulled out a chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. "Maribel, we need to talk." She wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from him, her dark eyes patient but guarded. "About Mr. Morrison's proposal. About us." The words came easier than he'd expected. "About what you asked me that night in my study." Something flickered in her expression, hope, carefully controlled. "I'm listening." Barrett took a breath, feeling like he was about to jump from a cliff with no guarantee of soft landing. "You said you wanted me to teach you how to be my wife. Well, I've been thinking about that, about what it would mean. And I think maybe the question isn't how to teach you to be my wife." Barrett met her eyes directly. "Maybe the question is whether I can learn how to be your husband." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility. Maribel's hand stilled in her lap, and Barrett could hear her careful breathing in the morning quiet. "What are you saying, Barrett?" The use of his first name sent warmth through his chest. "I'm saying that you were right the other night, about me or hiding from life, about being afraid. I'm saying that when I think about Morrison courting you, about some other man taking you away from here, from me, it feels like dying." Maribel's eyes glistened, but she didn't speak. "I'm saying that I've been a fool," Barrett continued, the words coming faster now. "Thinking I wasn't worthy of happiness. Thinking the past had to define the future. You make me want to be better than I am, Maribel. You make me want to try." "Barrett, let me finish." He reached across the table, covering her flour-dusted hands with his. "I can't promise to be the man you deserve. I can't promise to love you the way you should be loved, at least not right away. But I can promise to try, if you'll have me. If you'll teach me how to stop being afraid." Maribel was quiet for so long that Barrett began to fear he'd waited too long, that Morrison's formal proposal had changed something fundamental. Then she smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night of winter. "That's all I ever wanted," she said softly, "the chance to try together." Before Barrett could respond, she stood and walked to the kitchen window, pulling something from behind the flour canister. When she turned back, she held a folded piece of paper, yellow with age and soft from handling. "What's that?" "Something I wrote," she said, her cheeks coloring slightly. "After my parents died, when everything seemed impossible. I found it again last week and thought, well, I thought you might understand it." Barrett unfolded the paper carefully, recognizing the precise handwriting he'd seen on shopping lists and household notes. But this was different, flowing script that spoke of education and care. The words themselves stopped his breath. "When hope feels like a stranger, and faith seems far away. When yesterday's bright promise has faded into grey. Remember that the morning still follows darkest night, that love can bloom in ashes and wrongs can still make right. For every heart that's broken can learn to beat again, and every soul that's weary can find its peace within. So hold fast to tomorrow, though today brings only tears. The best of all our loving lies, waiting in our years." Barrett read it twice, then looked up to find Maribel watching him with nervous anticipation. "You wrote this?" His voice was rough with emotion. "I was 18 and feeling sorry for myself," she said, with attempted lightness. "Probably not very good. It's beautiful." Barrett folded the paper carefully, as if it were made of spun gold. "You're beautiful. Not just." He gestured helplessly. "Your mind, your heart, the way you see hope where others see only endings." Maribel's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "Barrett Kane, are you proposing to me?" "I'm asking you to marry me," he said simply. "I'm asking you to be my partner, my equal, my wife in every sense of the word. I'm asking you to help me build something new instead of just guarding something dead." "Yes." The word came without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." Barrett stood and moved around the table, taking her hands in his. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two people who had found their way to this moment through pain and persistence. "There's one more thing," Barrett said quietly. "Morrison expects an answer to his proposal. I think we should give him one together." Maribel's smile turned slightly wicked. "I think that's an excellent idea." 2 hours later, Frank Morrison arrived at the ranch with the confidence of a man certain of his welcome. He'd dressed in his finest clothes, pressed trousers, polished boots, a jacket that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. "Barrett," he called as he dismounted. "And lovely Maribel, I hope you've had time to consider my proposal." "We have," Barrett said, stepping closer to Maribel. "But I think there's been a misunderstanding." Morrison's smile faltered slightly. "Oh?" "Maribel won't be accepting your proposal," Barrett continued, his voice steady and sure. "She's already accepted mine." The transformation in Morrison's expression was swift and ugly. The practiced charm fell away, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Yours?" Morrison's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Barrett, surely you're joking. A woman of Maribel's background hardly seems suitable for a man of your standing." Barrett felt Maribel tense beside him, but when he glanced at her, he saw not hurt, but steel in her dark eyes. "My background," she said quietly, "taught me to recognize a gentleman when I meet one. It also taught me to recognize when I haven't." Morrison's face flushed red. "Now see here." "I think you should leave," Barrett interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded soldiers in battle. "And Frank, if I hear you've spoken ill of my future wife anywhere in this territory, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." For a moment, Morrison looked like he might challenge the warning. Then something in Barrett's expression must have convinced him otherwise. He mounted his horse with stiff dignity, but his parting words carried the bite of a man unused to defeat. "You're making a mistake, Barrett. Both of you. This territory has a long memory for people who forget their place." As Morrison rode away, Maribel slipped her hand into Barrett's. "Think he'll cause trouble?" "Probably." Barrett squeezed her fingers gently. "But whatever comes, we'll face it together." Standing there in the morning sunlight, watching their enemy disappear over the hill, Barrett felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the right person beside him. For the first time since Sarah's death, the future looked like something worth fighting for. 3 days of blissful planning followed Barrett's proposal. Maribel moved through her days with a lightness he'd never seen before, humming old hymns as she worked, her eyes bright with anticipation. They talked late into the evenings about their future, where they might honeymoon, how to expand the ranch house, names for the children they hoped to have. Barrett found himself smiling at random moments, catching glimpses of a life he'd never dared imagine. When Diego teased him about acting like a lovesick schoolboy, Barrett didn't even try to deny it. Then Morrison struck back, and he struck where Barrett was most vulnerable. The blow came on a sunny Thursday morning, delivered by Sheriff Tom Bradley, a decent man who'd known Barrett since the early days of the ranch. Bradley dismounted his horse with the reluctance of someone bearing bad news. "Barrett," he said without preamble, "I need to talk to you. Privately." Barrett's stomach clenched. "What's this about, Tom?" Bradley glanced around the ranch yard, noting Diego and the other hands within earshot. "Maybe we should go inside." In the study, Bradley refused the offer of coffee and got straight to the point. "Frank Morrison came to see me yesterday. Brought some documents he claims came from military records in Denver." Barrett's blood turned to ice water. He knew what was coming before Bradley reached into his coat pocket. "Says here you were court-martialed during the war," Bradley continued, unfolding official-looking papers. "Charges of insubordination and cowardice under fire." The word cowardice hit Barrett like a physical blow. "Tom, now I know you, Barrett. Known you for 15 years. You're no coward." Bradley's voice was carefully neutral, but Barrett could see the questions in his eyes. "But Morrison's making noise about this all, over Red Rock. Says a man with a dishonorable discharge has no business marrying a respectable woman, even one who—" He stopped, clearly uncomfortable. "Even one who used to be a servant," Barrett finished grimly. Morrison's exact words were cruder than that. Bradley folded the papers carefully. "He's demanding a public hearing, Barrett. Says the territory has a right to know the truth about your military service before you take a wife." Barrett sank into his chair, the weight of 15 years of shame crashing down on him. "What kind of hearing?" "Town council meeting. Next Tuesday. Morrison's filed formal charges that you obtained your land grant under false pretenses, claiming military honors you didn't earn." Bradley leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Barrett, I've got to ask, is any of this true?" The moment stretched like a held breath. Barrett could lie, could deny everything, and hope Morrison's evidence wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. Or he could finally face the truth he'd been running from for half his lifetime. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's true." Bradley's face fell. "Ah, hell, Barrett. But not the way Morrison's telling it." Barrett stood, walking to his desk with legs that felt like lead. "I was court-martialed for insubordination, Tom, for refusing a direct order to burn out a family of civilians. But it wasn't cowardice that made me disobey. It was conscience." He opened the desk drawer and withdrew the legal documents he'd kept hidden for so many years. His discharge papers, yellowed with age, told the whole story in official language that stripped away human emotion and left only cold facts. "I saved 4 lives," Barrett said, handing the papers to Bradley. "An old man and his daughter. 2 children under the age of 10. My commanding officer wanted them burned alive because he suspected them of harboring Confederate supplies. I searched that house myself, Tom. They had nothing but winter clothes and some grain." Bradley read in silence, his weathered face growing more troubled with each line. When he finished, he set the papers down with a heavy sigh. "Jesus, Barrett. Why didn't you ever tell anyone the real story? Who would have believed it?" Barrett's laugh was bitter. A disgraced soldier claiming he was the real hero. Besides, Sarah never knew the truth. She died thinking I was honorable, and I didn't want to burden her with the reality of my shame. "Shame?" Bradley's voice rose. "For saving innocent lives? For throwing away my career, my pension, my future, all for 4 people I didn't even know?" Barrett's voice cracked. Some days I wondered if they were worth it. And now? Barrett thought of Maribel, of the way she'd looked at him when he'd told her the story, not with pity or judgment, but with fierce pride. Now I know they were. But that doesn't change the legal facts. I was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. Morrison's right about that much. Bradley was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers again. There might be a way around this, he said finally. If we can prove the court-martial was unjust, based on orders that violated military law. Tom, that was 15 years ago. Half the men who could testify are dead, and the other half wouldn't risk their reputations for me. What about the family you saved? If we could find them, get them to testify, I never even learned their names. Barrett felt the weight of defeat settling over him like a shroud. They were just strangers in the wrong place at the wrong time. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Maribel appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said quietly. "But I couldn't help overhearing. The whole ranch could hear Sheriff Bradley's voice." Barrett felt shame burn through him like acid. Of all the ways for Maribel to learn the truth, this was the worst. Second-hand, from official documents that painted him as a coward and a fraud. "Maribel," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "May I see the papers?" she asked Bradley. The sheriff glanced at Barrett, who nodded reluctantly. Maribel read the documents with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, her expression growing more thoughtful with each paragraph. "This commanding officer," she said finally. "Colonel Marcus Stillwater. What happened to him after the war?" "Last I heard, he was running for territorial governor in Wyoming," Barrett said bitterly. "Apparently, burning civilians looks good on a political resume." Maribel was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the official seals on the discharge papers. Then she looked up at Barrett with an expression that took his breath away. Not disappointment or fear, but blazing determination. "You saved them," she said simply. "You risked everything to save 4 innocent people, and you've spent 15 years believing it made you a coward instead of a hero. Maribel, the law doesn't care about my motivations. The law isn't what matters here." Her voice carried absolute conviction. "What matters is that when you had to choose between following orders and following your conscience, you chose what was right. What matters is that somewhere in this world, there are children who grew up to have children of their own, because Barrett Kane was brave enough to say no when saying yes would have been easier." Barrett felt tears prick his eyes. "It doesn't change anything. Morrison still has the legal documents. The town council still has to hold their hearing." "Then we'll go to that hearing," Maribel said firmly. "And we'll tell them the truth, all of it. We'll let the people of Red Rock decide for themselves whether they want to condemn a man for saving lives. And if they do, if Morrison wins—" Barrett's voice was barely a whisper. Maribel stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "Then we'll face whatever comes together. But, Barrett, I need you to understand something. Learning this doesn't change how I feel about you. If anything, it makes me love you more." "How can you say that?" "Because now I know why you're the man you are. Why you treat people with dignity, regardless of their station. Why you've been so afraid to believe you deserve happiness." Her eyes blazed with unshed tears. "You've been carrying this burden alone for 15 years, believing it made you unworthy. But it's not a burden, Barrett. It's proof that you're exactly the man I thought you were." Barrett pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as the weight of years of shame began, finally, to lift. Tomorrow would bring the town council meeting and Morrison's accusations. There would be questions and judgment, and the possibility of losing everything they'd planned together. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Barrett Kane felt like a man worth loving. And that, he realized, made everything else worth fighting for. The days leading up to the town council meeting passed like the slow burn of a fuse toward dynamite. Word of Morrison's accusations spread through Red Rock faster than wildfire, carried on the tongues of gossips and the whispered conversations of decent folks who didn't know what to believe. Barrett found himself the subject of stares and speculation whenever he rode into town. Some looked at him with pity, others with suspicion, and a few with the cold judgment of people who'd already made up their minds. The weight of their scrutiny pressed down on him like a physical thing, making each trip to the general store or the bank feel like running a gauntlet. But it was the support that surprised him. "Don't you pay those fools no mind," old Mrs. Henderson told him when he stopped to water his horse at the town pump. "Any man who'd take in Jim Hartwell's girl and treat her decent is good enough for me, war record or not." Diego was even more direct. "Patron, if you want, the boys and I can have a conversation with Morrison, the kind that happens behind the saloon after dark." "No," Barrett said firmly. "This gets settled in the light of day, with words, not fists." "You sure about that?" Buck Wilson asked, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Because Morrison's been spreading poison all over the territory. Says you're a coward and a liar, and Miss Maribel deserves better than damaged goods." Barrett's hands clenched into fists, but Maribel's gentle touch on his arm kept him from saying something he'd regret. "Let him talk," she said quietly. "Words only have the power we give them. Easy to say, harder to live by." Barrett found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with doubts that crawled through his mind like poison. What if Morrison was right? What if he was just a broken-down soldier trying to claim a good woman who deserved better? It was Maribel who finally forced him to confront his fears. She found him on the porch 3 nights before the hearing, polishing his father's cavalry saber with hands that shook slightly. The sword was a family heirloom, passed down from his grandfather, who'd fought in the Mexican War, carried by his father in the Indian campaigns, and finally inherited by Barrett when he'd joined the 5th Colorado. He'd taken it into battle exactly once, the day he'd disobeyed orders and saved those 4 civilians. Afterward, it had felt too heavy with irony to wear, so he'd packed it away with the rest of his military gear and tried to forget it existed. "You're going to polish the steel right off that blade," Maribel observed, settling into the chair beside him. "Couldn't sleep," Barrett muttered, not looking up from his work. "Barrett!" Her voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." When he finally met her eyes, she reached over and stilled his hands on the sword. "Talk to me," she said. "Tell me what's eating at you." Barrett set down the saber and leaned back in his chair, feeling suddenly exhausted. What if Morrison's right? What if I'm just a broken man trying to drag you down with me? Is that what you think? I don't know what I think anymore. Barrett scrubbed his hands over his face. 15 years I've been telling myself that saving those people was the right thing to do. But what if it wasn't? What if I was just too weak to follow orders? And I've been lying to myself ever since? Maribel was quiet for a long moment, her eyes thoughtful. Then she stood and disappeared into the house, returning a few minutes later with her grandmother's Bible, the same weathered leather book she'd carried the day she arrived at the ranch. "My grandmother gave me this when I was 8 years old," she said, settling back into her chair. "She told me something that day that I've never forgotten." Barrett waited as she opened the Bible, her fingers finding a passage marked with a faded ribbon. She said, "Maribel, there will come times in your life when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. The world will try to convince you that easy is better, that right is just a pretty word for fools. But the measure of a person isn't how many easy choices they make. It's how they act when right and easy point in different directions." Barrett felt something shift in his chest as her words sank in. "You had a choice that day," Maribel continued. "Follow orders and watch innocent people die, or risk everything to save them. Easy versus right. You chose right, and it cost you dearly. But Barrett..." She reached over and took his hand. "Those children you saved? They went home that night. They grew up, probably had families of their own. Because of you, there are people alive in this world who wouldn't be otherwise. But the court-martial was the price you paid for being better than your orders." Maribel's voice carried absolute conviction. "Any military system that punishes a man for refusing to murder civilians is a system that deserves to be disobeyed." Barrett stared at her, feeling 15 years of self-doubt cracking like ice in spring sun. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make everything so clear. Make me feel like maybe I'm not the failure I thought I was." Maribel smiled, the expression transforming her face in the lamplight. "Because I love you, Barrett Kane. All of you. The hero and the haunted man, the soldier and the rancher, the part of you that saved those people and the part that's been punishing yourself for it ever since." Before Barrett could respond, the sound of horses interrupted them. Diego appeared from the direction of town, riding hard with news written across his weathered face. "Patron," he called as he dismounted. "Morrison's been busy. He's brought in witnesses for the hearing." Barrett's stomach dropped. "What kind of witnesses?" "Men from your old unit. Couple of them, anyway." Diego's expression was grim. "They're staying at the hotel, been drinking with Morrison all evening. From what I could overhear, they're not here to speak in your favor." Barrett felt the ground shifting beneath him again. His former comrades, men who'd been there that day, who'd seen him disobey orders and face court-martial. Their testimony could destroy any chance he had of clearing his name. "Who?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "Sergeant Collins and Corporal Hayes, from what I could tell. Maybe others coming in on tomorrow's stage." Barrett remembered both men clearly. Collins had been his senior sergeant, a career soldier who believed in following orders without question. Hayes had been younger, eager to prove himself, the kind of man who saw mercy as weakness. "They'll testify against you," Maribel said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Probably." Barrett picked up the cavalry saber again, its weight suddenly feeling significant in his hands. "Collins never forgave me for the court-martial. Said I made the whole unit look bad." "And Hayes?" "Hayes was there when it happened. He saw me countermand the colonel's orders, saw me let those civilians escape. If Morrison's promised him money or position, he'll say whatever needs saying." Diego spat into the dust. "So what do we do, Patron?" Barrett looked at the sword in his hands, thinking about the men who'd carried it before him, the battles they'd fought, the honor they'd tried to uphold. His grandfather had carried it against Santa Anna's army in Mexico. His father had used it to protect settlers from raiders. Both men had faced impossible odds and found the courage to stand for what they believed in. "We prepare," Barrett said finally, standing with new resolve. "Morrison wants a fight? Then we give him one. But we fight it our way, with truth and dignity." "Barrett!" Maribel started to say something, but he held up a hand. "No, Maribel. I'm done running from this. Done hiding from my past like it was something shameful. He lifted the cavalry saber, feeling its familiar balance. This sword has been carried by 3 generations of Cain men, all of them fighting for what they believed was right. Maybe it's time I remembered that I'm one of them. Diego grinned, the first genuine smile Barrett had seen from him in days. Now you sound like the man I've been working for all these years. Barrett looked at Maribel, who was watching him with something that might have been pride shining in her dark eyes. There's something I need to do, he said. Something I should have done 15 years ago. What's that? Barrett sheathed the saber with a decisive motion. I'm going to find those people I saved. If they're still alive, if I can track them down, maybe they'll testify on my behalf. Barrett, that's impossible. You said yourself you never even learned their names. Then I'll hire a detective. I'll search every record, follow every lead. Barrett felt determination settling over him like armor. Morrison wants to use my past against me. Fine. But he's going to hear the whole story, not just the parts that make him look righteous. Maribel stood and moved to his side, her presence a steady warmth against the cool night air. We'll find them, she said simply. We? Did you think I was going to let you face this alone? Her smile was fierce as summer lightning. You're going to be my husband, Barrett Cain. Your battles are my battles now. As Barrett looked into her eyes, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war. The absolute certainty that he was not alone. Whatever came at the town council meeting, whatever Morrison and his witnesses threw at them, they would face it together. The battle for his reputation, his future, and his right to happiness was about to begin. But for the first time in 15 years, Barrett Cain felt ready to fight. The Red Rock Town Hall had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered on Tuesday morning. Word of the hearing had spread throughout the territory, drawing curious onlookers, concerned neighbors, and those who simply enjoyed watching a man's reputation get torn apart in public. Barrett arrived early, wearing his best suit and carrying himself with the bearing of a man prepared for battle. At his throat, Maribel had pinned her grandmother's cameo brooch, a delicate piece of carved ivory that had belonged to her family for generations. She wore it openly for the first time, a symbol of her decision to stand as Barrett's equal, not hide in the shadows as a servant. You don't have to sit up front, Barrett murmured as they took their seats. This could get ugly. Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of ugly, Maribel replied, smoothing her dark blue dress. It was the finest she owned, carefully mended and pressed for this moment. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't let them intimidate you. The town council filed in. 5 men Barrett had known for years, their faces carefully neutral. Mayor Williamson, who'd bought cattle from Barrett more than once. Doc Patterson, who'd treated Barrett's ranch hands through illnesses and injuries. George Hartley, who ran the general store and had always been fair in his dealings. Then Morrison entered with his witnesses, and Barrett felt his stomach clench. Sergeant Collins looked older, grayer, but his eyes held the same hard certainty they'd carried during the war. Corporal Hayes had grown soft around the middle, his uniform replaced by a businessman's attire, but his weak chin and calculating gaze were unchanged. Behind them came a surprise that made Barrett's breath catch. Colonel Marcus Stillwater himself, dressed in civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the same arrogant bearing that had defined him 15 years ago. Jesus, Barrett whispered. Morrison brought Stillwater. Maribel's hand found his under the table, her fingers steady and warm. Remember what we talked about, she said quietly. Truth has its own power. Mayor Williamson called the hearing to order, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. We're here today to address allegations brought by Mr. Frank Morrison regarding the military service record of Barrett Kane. Mr. Morrison, you may present your case." Morrison stood with the smooth confidence of a practiced speaker. He looked every inch the successful rancher, well-dressed, articulate, commanding attention without effort. "Gentlemen of the Council, citizens of Red Rock," Morrison began, his voice carrying to the back of the packed hall. "We gather today because a fundamental deception has been brought to light. For 15 years, Barrett Kane has lived among us as a respected member of this community. He obtained his land grant through claims of honorable military service. He's conducted business based on a reputation for integrity and courage." Morrison paused for effect, letting his words settle over the crowd. "But that reputation is built on lies. Barrett Kane is not a war hero. He's a coward who was court-martialed for refusing to obey direct orders. He was dishonorably discharged from the United States Army for insubordination in the face of the enemy." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Barrett felt faces turning toward him, saw the doubt and suspicion in eyes that had looked at him with respect for years. "I have here," Morrison continued, holding up the official documents, "Barrett Kane's actual military records, court-martial proceedings that show him to be unfit for command, unworthy of trust, and guilty of cowardice under fire." "That's a lie." Barrett's voice cut through the hall like a blade. Morrison smiled coldly. "I thought you might say that, Barrett, which is why I've brought witnesses, men who served with you, who saw your cowardice firsthand." Sergeant Collins stood, his weathered face grim. "I was there," he said, in the flat tone of a man stating facts. "Captain Kane received direct orders from Colonel Stillwater to clear a suspected enemy position. Instead of following those orders, he allowed potential enemy sympathizers to escape." "They were civilians," Barrett said, rising to his feet. "Women and children." "They were suspects in a military operation," Collins replied, "and you put your personal feelings above your duty to your country." Corporal Hayes nodded eagerly. "I saw it too. Captain Kane let them go, even though they might have been harboring enemy supplies. It was clear insubordination." The crowd was growing restless, voices rising in discussion. Barrett could feel the mood shifting against him, see doubt spreading across faces that had been friendly just moments before. Then Colonel Stillwater stood, and the hall fell silent. "Barrett Kane," Stillwater said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "was the most insubordinate officer I ever had the misfortune to command. When faced with clear, direct orders to neutralize a potential threat, he chose sentiment over duty. His court-martial was not only justified, it was necessary to maintain discipline in the ranks." Barrett felt the walls closing in around him. These men were painting him as a coward, a failure, a disgrace to the uniform. The truth of what had really happened that day, the innocence of the family he'd saved, the moral courage it had taken to disobey an immoral order, was being buried under official testimony and military authority. But as he looked out at the crowd, he caught sight of Diego in the back row, his foreman's weathered face set with determination. Beside Diego stood Buck Wilson, Tom Henley, and young Jake Martinez, his ranch hands, men who knew his character through years of shared work and hardship. And beside him, Maribel sat with her head high, the cameo brooch catching the light like a badge of honor. She met his eyes and nodded once, a gesture that said more clearly than words. "Now, tell them who you really are." Barrett stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the hall upon him. In his vest pocket, Sarah's stopped watch seemed heavier than lead, a reminder of time frozen, of a life lived in the shadow of the past. But beside him, Marybelle's presence was a steady warmth, and in her hand lay the new wedding ring that had once belonged to his late wife. Not a replacement, but a symbol of new beginnings built on the foundation of honored love. "Mayor Williamson," Barrett said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, "I'd like to respond to these accusations." "Of course," Williamson replied. "You have the right to defend yourself." Barrett walked to the front of the hall, turning to face the crowd. These were his neighbors, people who'd shared meals with him, bought cattle from him, trusted him with their business and their friendship. Now they looked at him with uncertainty, waiting to see which version of Barrett Kane was the truth. "Everything, Colonel, Stillwater and his men have said is factually correct," Barrett began, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. "I did disobey a direct order. I was court-martialed for insubordination. I was dishonorably discharged from the United States Army." Morrison's smile of triumph was premature. "But they've left out the most important part of the story," Barrett continued. "The part about why I disobeyed that order." He looked directly at Colonel Stillwater, seeing the older man's face tighten with anticipated challenge. "Tell them about the family, Colonel. Tell them about the old man and his daughter, about the two children who couldn't have been more than 8 and 10 years old." "They were suspected enemy sympathizers," Stillwater began. "They were innocent civilians." Barrett cut him off, his voice rising. "I searched that house myself, Colonel. You remember that, don't you? I reported to you personally that there were no enemy supplies, no weapons, no evidence of Confederate sympathy, just a family trying to survive in the middle of a war zone." Stillwater's face flushed red. "The intelligence indicated—" "The intelligence was wrong, and you knew it." Barrett's words rang with conviction. "But you ordered me to burn them out anyway, to set fire to their home with them inside, because it was easier than admitting our information was false." The hall had gone completely silent. Even Morrison looked uncertain now, as if the narrative was slipping away from him. "So yes," Barrett continued, addressing the crowd again, "I disobeyed that order. I told my men to stand down. I gave that family time to escape before we burned their house. And I've spent 15 years wondering if I made the right choice." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces before him. "But I'm not wondering anymore, because Marybelle helped me understand something I'd forgotten, that the measure of a man isn't whether he follows orders, but whether he follows his conscience when the two conflict." Barrett's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Those children went home that night. They lived to grow up, to have families of their own. Somewhere in this world, there are people alive because I chose to save lives instead of following orders." "But you were court-martialed," Morrison interjected desperately. "You were dishonorably discharged." "Yes, I was." Barrett turned to face his accuser directly. "And I've worn that discharge like a badge of shame for 15 years. But standing here today, looking at all of you, I realize something. I'd rather be dishonorably discharged for saving innocent lives than honorably decorated for burning children alive." A new voice spoke from the back of the hall. "That's the Barrett Kane I know." All heads turned to see Diego standing, his hat in his hands. The weathered foreman looked uncomfortable with the attention, but his voice was steady. "I've worked for this man for 12 years, Diego said. "I've seen him risk his own life to save a drowning calf. I've watched him share his last dollar with a neighbor in need. If Senor Barrett says he saved a family, then he saved a family. And if that makes him a coward, then I don't understand what courage means." Buck Wilson stood next. "Diego's right. Barrett Kane pulled me out of a burning barn 3 years ago. Nearly got killed doing it. If that's what cowards do, then I'll take a coward over a hero any day." One by one, other voices joined them. Mrs. Henderson, telling how Barrett had helped her through her husband's illness. Doc Patterson, recounting how Barrett had donated money for medical supplies during the typhoid outbreak. George Hartley, describing Barrett's fairness in business dealings even when it cost him profit. But it was Maribel who delivered the final blow to Morrison's case. She stood gracefully, the cameo brooch glinting at her throat, and walked to Barrett's side. "Frank Morrison," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "You've spent this morning trying to convince people that Barrett is unworthy of respect because he chose mercy over orders. But I want these good people to consider something else." She looked around the room, meeting eyes with calm confidence. "What does it say about a man who would destroy another's reputation simply because the woman he desired chose someone else? What does it say about character when a man responds to rejection with revenge?" Morrison's face went white, then red. "That has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with this," Maribel continued, "because this entire hearing is nothing more than a spurned suitor's attempt at revenge. Barrett Kane asked me to marry him, and I said yes. Everything else is just noise." She turned to face the crowd, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "I'm proud to marry a man who saved innocent lives. I'm proud to marry a man who chose conscience over career. And if Barrett Kane is a coward, then I'll gladly spend my life married to the bravest coward in Colorado Territory." The applause started slowly, then built like thunder rolling across the mountains. Barrett looked out at the faces of his neighbors and saw not judgment, but understanding. Not condemnation, but respect. For the first time in 15 years, Barrett Kane felt truly worthy of the woman who stood beside him. 3 weeks later, Barrett stood on the same porch where this journey had begun. But everything had changed. The morning sun painted the mountains gold and purple, just as it always had. But now the light seemed brighter, the air cleaner, the future full of promise instead of shadows. In his hands, he held a hand-carved hope chest, weeks of careful work during the long evenings after the hearing. Every joint was perfect, every surface smooth as silk. The cedar would protect whatever treasures Maribel chose to store inside, just as their love would protect the life they were building, together. The town council had cleared him of all charges, of course. Morrison's case had collapsed under the weight of truth and community support. Colonel Stillwater had left Red Rock the same evening, his political ambitions in Wyoming likely dead after word spread of his role in the attempted character assassination. Morrison himself had departed 2 days later, selling his ranch to a cattle company from Denver and disappearing without so much as a goodbye. But the real victory hadn't been legal. It had been personal. For the first time since Sarah's death, Barrett felt whole. The pocket watch in his vest had started ticking again, repaired by the town clockmaker as a wedding gift. Time was moving forward at last. "Barrett?" Maribel's voice called from inside the house, warm with laughter. "Are you going to stand out there, admiring your carpentry all morning, or are you going to help me with these flowers?" He smiled, setting the hope chest carefully on the porch rail. Today was their wedding day, a small ceremony in the church where Maribel had found comfort during her darkest hours, witnessed by the community that had rallied to their defense. Inside, he found her arranging wildflowers in the parlor, her dark hair pinned up with Sarah's pearl combs, another gift willingly given, another bridge between past and future. She wore a simple white dress that Diego's wife had altered to fit her perfectly, and around her neck hung a new necklace, a delicate gold chain Barrett had ordered from Denver, with a small cross that caught the morning light. "You look beautiful," he said, the words inadequate for what he felt looking at her. "Thank you." She turned in his arms, adjusting the black string tie at his throat. "And you look like a man who's finally learned to believe in happy endings." Through the window, Barrett could see their guests arriving. Diego and his family, dressed in their Sunday best. Buck Wilson, clean-shaven and wearing a suit that actually fit. Doc Patterson and his wife, Mrs. Henderson with her famous apple pie, George Hartley from the store, and a dozen other neighbors who'd stood with them when it mattered most. Sheriff Bradley arrived with his wife and a surprise, a telegram that had come in on the morning stage. "This came for you from Austin, Texas," Bradley said, handing Barrett the yellow paper. "Figured it might be important, coming today and all." Barrett unfolded the telegram with trembling hands, Maribel reading over his shoulder. The words were brief but extraordinary. "Mr. Barrett Kane, Red Rock, Colorado Territory. Stop. Read about your hearing in Denver newspaper. Stop. Am daughter you saved 15 years ago near Willow Creek. Stop. Father and I remember your kindness every day. Stop. Congratulations on wedding. Stop. You are hero to our family always. Stop. Mary Catherine Walsh." Maribel's eyes filled with tears as she read the message. "She remembers," she whispered. "That little girl remembers." Barrett felt something break open in his chest. Not pain this time, but pure joy. The choice that had haunted him for 15 years, the decision that had cost him everything he thought he wanted, had been worth it. The children had grown up. They remembered. They were grateful. "I need to write her back," Barrett said, his voice thick with emotion. "After the ceremony," Maribel said firmly, taking his arm. "Right now, we have a wedding to attend." The service was simple and beautiful. Pastor Mackenzie spoke about second chances and the courage to love again. Maribel's vows were poetry, speaking of hope found in unexpected places and hearts that learned to trust again. Barrett's were simpler, but no less heartfelt, a promise to cherish her, protect her, and never again doubt that he was worthy of the gift she offered. When they kissed as husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause and cheers. Barrett thought of all the roads that had led to this moment: the war, the court-martial, Sarah's death, Maribel's brave question that night in his study. Every triumph and failure had been necessary. Every choice had led them here. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung from the cottonwood trees. Diego played guitar while his wife sang Mexican folk songs that spoke of love enduring through hardship. The hope chest was displayed prominently, already filling with gifts from their friends: linens embroidered by Mrs. Henderson, a set of silver spoons from the general store, a beautiful quilt made by the church ladies. As the sun set and the dancing began, Barrett found himself standing apart for a moment, watching his new wife laugh with Mrs. Patterson, while Diego's children played tag around the tables. This was what happiness looked like. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of love strong enough to bear whatever came. "Senor Barrett." Diego appeared at his elbow, 2 glasses of whiskey in his weathered hands. "A toast?" Barrett accepted the glass gratefully. "To what?" "To courage," Diego said simply. "The kind that saves children from burning houses. The kind that asks impossible questions. The kind that builds hope chests for the future instead of shrines to the past." They drank, the whiskey burning warm all the way down. When Barrett looked for Maribel again, she was walking toward him through the lamplight, her hand extended in invitation. "Dance with me, husband," she said, the word like music on her lips. As they moved together under the stars, Barrett thought about time, how it could stop in moments of perfect happiness, how it could heal even the deepest wounds, how it could transform questions into answers and strangers into soulmates. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, marking the seconds of a life finally moving forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to choose courage over fear. But tonight, Barrett Kane danced with his wife in the glow of lantern light, surrounded by friends who'd proven that community could triumph over malice, that truth could overcome lies, and that love, patient, persistent, transformative love, could indeed bloom in the ashes of a broken heart. The hope chest waited on the porch, ready to hold the treasures of a lifetime spent together. And for the first time in 15 years, Barrett Kane believed he had treasures worth keeping,